What do you think Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would say about the civil rights movement if he were alive today? Would he think there had been significant improvements since his death, or would he be concerned that the nation has taken a step backwards? And what about politics and executive positions? Would he say the work is done now that an African American president has been elected and re-elected? And would he be shocked to know how many Black Americans are imprisoned in 2014? Well, we asked 4 experts in African American culture and lifestyle to give their opinions on what Dr. King would say on those topics and more. And it all begins right now. He was clearly one of the greatest civil rights leaders this nation had ever seen. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. fought for human rights, equal opportunities, and justice for all before being assassinated in May of 1968. Others have continued his fight, and many feel the goals he set have been achieved, but still more think the country has taken a step backwards when it comes to equality for all. We want to know where you stand on that and what you think Dr. King would have to say about it today. Hello everyone, I'm Lynn Doyle. Thank you so much for joining us as we honor the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. If you'd like to join in at any time with your thoughts, your opinions, and your remembrances of Dr. King, you can email me at lynn@lynndoyle.net. I have 4 great guests joining me for this discussion devoted to Dr. King, including the Honorable Renee Cardwell Hughes, who is a retired Common Pleas Court judge in Philadelphia, where she served for 16 years. Chad Dion Lassiter is a national expert on race relations and the president of Black Men at Penn at the University of Pennsylvania School of Social Policy and Practice. Deborah Rainey is an attorney who calls herself the Compassionate Lawyer. She's also an internet radio host of For the People, Law in Plain Language. And rounding out our panel is Lloyd Friedman. He too is an attorney. He's the chairman of the board for Big Brothers Big Sisters of Burlington, Camden, and Gloucester counties in New Jersey. Thank you all for joining me. And let me tell you how impressed I am that I have the 4 of you together. I've been looking forward to this discussion for quite some time, so I hope that you are as well.
Oh,
Good to see you.
Definitely.
I want to begin with your honor. Thank you so much for joining us.
I'm happy to be here.
Let me ask you what you think Dr. King would say about race relations in America in 2014 if he were alive today.
I think his feeling would be that it's complex. We've clearly made improvements with the younger generation. When you look at millennials are much better with diversity than people of my generation or older people. And so I think the country is in transition. That section, the millennials, they are very easy with different cultures, different races. The older generations still have their challenges.
And what might some of those challenges be in the opinion of the panel?
I'm not so sure that I agree 100% with you, Judge, respectfully. What I think that Dr. King would say first and foremost is he would be appalled at the state of the relations between the races, particularly the major ones, us black folks and white folks, and even more terrified at the inner relationship between African Americans. So I think where we stand now in 2014, based on what Dr. King stood for, I think he would be a little bit heartbroken.
Chad, I'd like to know what you think about that. Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to know if you don't see a difference by age group, because I don't disagree fundamentally with your concept, but I do disagree that the millennials, the 20-somethings, the late teens, because of, in particular, his work on integrating education and really making us part of the society, I think younger people are easier with race. But I do think we still have incredible challenges, and he would be disappointed that people our age and people who would be his generation have not moved at the speed at which you would believe that we could have.
I would agree with you, but for one thing. Yes, with respect to the educated millennials, sure. They hang together, they party together, dance together. Those that come from working class families, no way. They separate. They don't party and hang out with each other.
Because of the segregation of the schools.
And because of what they see at home and what they hang around with. And those are the ones that make up the majority of what we're talking about. So
Chad and I have had this conversation on the show many times about black versus black. It's not always just black versus white.
Yeah.
It's sometimes within the community of black people itself.
Certainly, but I want to back up and simply say Dr. King would verbalize that we're not post-racial, first and foremost. I think also if we look at Dr. King, he, towards the tail end of his life, was moving from civil rights to human rights. He was looking at things from a humanity perspective. King also verbalized that the moral arc of the universe is bent towards justice. I think he would be dismayed at the moral compass that is lacking in our country, both from the black church, from a political standpoint, from the elites. I think he also would be upset at what he talked about when he verbalized the triple threats of evil, when he looked at the military-industrial complex, the prison-industrial complex, and poverty. And so I think King would be able to provide a stern critique at the things that we're not doing, because King was not just about, you know, the figureheads with regards to the movements. King was really about the movement. So he wasn't about particular leaders leading the race forward. King was really about a coalition of humanity coming together to push us to a level of equality.
But I think there's something to be said about that leadership, though, because that entire movement that Dr. King was spearheading, if you will, the civil rights movement, it was being led by a lot of people in my age group. Dr. King, when he was assassinated, we know, he was in his late 30s. So many of the significant things that he did during his time on Earth, they were in his late 20s and his early 30s. So I think Dr. King would be appalled that we don't have a lot more younger leadership that is kind of picking up the baton and taking that movement to the next level.
I think we have to look at this from a different prism. It's not that I disagree fundamentally with anything that you've said, but I think we need to slice it slightly differently. You mentioned the military-industrial complex. This country would not have the level of integration that it does had not the military integrated. The military, A, raised the economic status of a large majority of African Americans.
Raised the economic status, but didn't do anything with respect to our becoming equal as humans. I spent 10 years in the Army in military intelligence, and the hardest thing for me was not being a female, it was being black. So I agree with you and I disagree with you.
But I think that's going to happen throughout this conversation, in that it is it is not black and white. There's a kernel of truth in everything. So when you talk about the lack of leadership among millennials, I actually see millennials leading in a very different way. They're not necessarily gravitating toward traditional politics. We have for decades thought that politics was the only way to lead the nation to a better place. I think now we see a more nuanced view that it's economic development, that
it's more grassroots.
But so it's not necessarily always looking to political leadership, but there has been great steps forward made by millennials, and I do see, I don't contend that any institution is perfect, whether it's the government or the military. No institution is perfect. But there are some things that have advanced our position. We have some failings that we need to claim.
I think King would also, and I think we can all reach consensus that Dr. King would say that we're more intolerant than we are tolerant during his time.
I agree with that 100%.
And I think that that's one of the things I think we need to really work on, is that we don't really need leaders. We need to look at as a coalition of humanity coming together to be able to say we're all leaders, and that we don't have to wait for a clarion call. What typically happens in the African American communities when something polarizing happens along the color line, we're looking at Al Sharpton or we're looking at Jesse Jackson.
Here we go.
What we have to do is push the paradigm to recognize that there are multiple leaders who may not appear on MSNBC or your show, but every day they're leading from behind. They're trying to move us to a level of being more tolerant.
You know,
and organizations.
A lot of people think that because an African American president was elected for the first time, that basically Dr. King's dream has come true.
Why did I forget about Bill Clinton?
Because Bill Clinton didn't lift us all up. But
he's on our
but anyone who thinks that we are in a post-racial world is
retarded.
Delusional. They're delusional.
They're retarded.
Well, but is there any chance that we're going to see a post-racial world, though?
No.
Not until every individual at this table, every individual in this country starts with this one idea. We're all humans. If I can't look at Chad sitting across from me and not see the color of his skin first, no, we're never going to.
I don't ever want to be there.
Not
if
just
that's
see
the
color of his skin.
if that's the definition of post-racial, I don't want to be there.
Acknowledge, but acknowledge. Right?
See,
most
post-racial,
people, when we interact with each other, let's be really honest.
See,
I walk into an all-white club, I'm not going to be comfortable until I meet those eyes of that friendly person that sees me as a person.
Okay,
everyone has to say, let's start there.
But see,
if we can at least get that conversation going, then perhaps.
But I think that while I don't want to sugarcoat anything, that is not my personality. I think it is a mistake not to sit here and at least acknowledge that we have made some significant advances.
Oh, I agree.
They don't take us where we need to be.
We have, but I don't think we'll ever be post-racial. Because to be post-racial, you have to do the work of being post-racial. It's not just articulating you're being post-racial. To be post-racial means that white supremacy dies, institutional racism dies, white privilege dies, black supremacy dies, and black victimization dies. The country was founded on the principles of white supremacy. So we can't be post-racial in an era that was created from that venue. One of the things that we can do, though, is every day get up and work on combating American racism, combating black victimization, uprooting, you know, all the isms in our society, and that's what gives us comfort as social change agents.
And Lynn, I just still find it so surprising that there are people out there who say that we may be in this post-racial world or this post-racial era, considering the person that they think is the figurehead of Dr. King's, the crystallization of his dream, President Obama, gave a speech just down the street about racial tensions in America when he gave his, you know, his now notorious speech about race relations when he was still campaigning. And he lays out that there's still, like you said, white supremacy, and we still have to rely upon affirmative action, and that non-black people or non-minorities, they still really are resentful toward things like affirmative action.
And a president who's received the most death threats of any president.
My goodness.
On that note, I'm afraid I have to take a break, but we do want to invite our viewers to be part of the conversation. It's your call after all. If you would like to join in and tell us what you think, we have a couple of questions for you. We want to know what you think Dr. Martin Luther King would say about the world in which we are living and whether you think there's been real progress or not. You can also tell us if you think poor education for blacks still exists, and we want to know why you think there are so many African Americans incarcerated today. We're going to talk about all of that and more. So if you'd like to join in, you can email me. I'm directly at lynn@lynndoyle.net. You can also find us on Facebook, and you can follow me on Twitter at Lynn Doyle TV. I'll see you in 3 minutes. As we do this time of the year, we're paying tribute to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who is arguably the best-known civil rights leader of our generation. Coming up in this segment, who will pick up the mantle for future generations? You can let me know what you think about that by emailing me at lynn@lynndoyle.net. That's me, by the way. I'm Lynn Doyle, and this is It's Your Call. We are having a great discussion here about the state of the African American community in 2014. Love to know what you have to say about that. One thing that you have to talk about, and I think the panel agrees when you're talking about the state of the black community, is the number of African Americans in this country that are incarcerated and how those numbers are disproportionate to the number of other populations in our jails. I have to turn to you as our premier expert on this and ask, why is it that so many African Americans are in our jails?
Well, let's first lay the foundation. Between the ages of 18 and 34, 1/3 of all African American men are under the supervision of the criminal justice system.
1/3?
1/3. That means that they are either incarcerated, on probation, or on parole. So it's a significant number. Now, as the mother of an African American young man, I always flip the script and say, well, 2/3 are not. But the reality is that 1/3 is a significantly disproportionate number because African Americans only represent somewhere between 10 and 11% of the population, depending upon which census data you look at. The numbers are disproportionate. Let me give a little data, and then I'd like for all of my colleagues to jump in. A little of the data is the following. In the late 70s, early 80s, America launched the war on drugs. And the war on drugs was structured in such a way that had an incredibly racially negative impact. When the Congress decided that crack would be punished at 100 times the rate of coke.
Right.
Coke is the drug of the middle class. Crack is the drug of low income. And so what happened when they imposed mandatories, and those mandatories were attached that you only needed 5 grams of crack to get 5 years in prison, but you needed 500 grams of coke to get that same 5 years. We saw an incredible spike starting in the 80s and going all the way up until the last 3 years.
The impact that it has on the community with all of these young and old African American men in jail, what does it have?
It leaves a void in the community when you look at the impact of incarceration on families. And so some of the work that all four of us are doing around the table as it relates to mentoring youth who parents are incarcerated either in the state or federal prison is really essential. I think the judge is absolutely right when she articulated that this whole notion of war on drugs really was a war on people of color.
Exactly.
And then there's also a profit margin that some of our prisons are profitized. There are prison profiteers. We also need to really look at the way we incarcerate individuals. A lot of our individuals need drug treatment programs. They need some biopsychosocial assessments and some counseling. They don't need to be in prison languishing in these dungeons in the manner that they do. And then we're giving jobs in various areas to low-income individuals who are white, who have no jobs in these areas in Western Pennsylvania and other places. And I think that what we need to also look at, and I want to turn to one of my colleagues, is that we incarcerate more than anyone on the face of the earth.
Right.
Except for Russia and China.
We're
Okay.
up with Russia right
Yeah.
now.
That's right, we
And
are.
so it has
We
to
are
be an
even to
alternative
Russia.
to that.
And we also, no one's mentioned, we need to look at law enforcement. It's not, sure, Congress
Arrest
passed the
discretion.
mandatory minimum, the arrest discretion, exactly, Judge, thank you. There is no reason to suggest that in Montgomery County, for example, in eastern Pennsylvania, we make up about 13% of the population. Yet, time and time again, when I walk through the doors of the Court of Common Pleas in Montgomery County, African-American males, African-American females, young, old, middle class, make up about 68% of the defendants. That's ludicrous. From having a nickel bag of marijuana, which in Pennsylvania says it's a
It's still
minimum amount,
illegal.
30 days, they're standing in there faced with one charge. The same non-black person standing there with the same amount of marijuana is automatically given a 30-day summer.
Do you think that
So,
the general
just-
population may think that the incarcerated individuals are primarily in there because of violence, because of
Yes.
crime, as opposed to drugs? Is that a message that for some reason has been sent to the general population, or I should say the white folks?
We actually call it the CNN effect. Okay, now, I hate to say it, but that's what we call it. It's the CNN effect, where the media, if it bleeds, it leads.
Right.
Yeah.
And so
Right.
the media is focused on reporting about violence and doesn't report about non-violent, drug-addicted offenders.
And that same stigma carries on with these ex-offenders
Right.
once they are actually released into the world. And now you need them to go out there and get jobs and be productive members of
But they
society.
can't.
And they cannot.
They
They've got no
can't vote.
training. They can't.
Well, no,
how do they
but they
compete against-
also they cannot vote
can vote, you're
by
right.
law. In Pennsylvania, they can, but in many states there are
Their civil rights are
there are
stripped.
23 states in which, if you have a felony conviction, you cannot vote. You cannot get student loans. Up until last year, that was one of the things the president did get. You could not get student loans. You still, to this day, cannot live in publicly funded housing, so low-income housing. So there are a lot of
Knowingly
restrictions.
So you get back into the cycle.
It's a terrible
But one of the things that I
catch-22.
do need to say, because this goes back to this question that we've been discussing, like where are we in the world? Because I am the mother of a child in this age group, I have to look at how do I go forward. And how I go forward is, we have an African American Secretary of Corrections in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, John Wetzel. John Wetzel chose, in the face of enormous political opposition, not to build a new prison in Western Pennsylvania, because he said we already incarcerate too much. He has been the advocate for programs, and if the governor's not funding the programs,
Again, we're back to the catch-22. I asked this question on my Facebook page, and I have to say, I deal in controversial issues. I mean, that is what the topic of the show, that's the purpose of the show. But I have to tell you that our Facebook fans chimed in quite zealously about this question when I asked about black men who are incarcerated. I said, why do you think it is that so many African Americans are in prison? And these are just a sampling of some of the answers that I got from you. I had to weed out the ones that were so very nasty, okay? Wow. Patrick writes, it's a combination of a lot of reasons, economic, social, education, etc. There can be no denying the fact that minorities are grossly disadvantaged in the legal system when it comes to comparing them to whites. Rich writes, about 70% of African American men were raised only by their mother. He thinks that it's the single parent syndrome, and I have to tell you, he got nailed by the other writers. And then Kendrick counters stating, here we go again with these stereotypes and this racist nonsense. There are plenty of men who go to jail and have been raised in a two-parent household, both black and white and other colors. So go ahead, Rich, explain that. Those two proceeded to go back and forth for quite some time on the Facebook page. And then I actually had to explain for one of the first times since I've been doing this on Facebook, the purpose of the question was so that we could discuss they accused me of going there, of like trying to use the race card, and that was not at all the purpose of it. It was just, I was wondering what the general population thought about why so many African Americans are incarcerated.
Necessary conversation. It has
Yeah,
to
you
be.
can't have a dialogue when everybody
is-
says that you're doing something, either you're playing the race card or you're going for ratings, or you're never going to talk to white people because you're black.
We have to advance the dialogue, because if we don't talk about these things, we never craft solutions that address the underlying.
And the thing for me is I don't worry about the critics and the naysayers, but those of us who are doing the work and those of us who do not look at, the challenges that African American males, Latino males, and white males face from a lens of being stereotypical.
Right.
I'm on the Board of Trustees, Philly Prisons, and black males and Latino males I work with every day are there, not simply because of violent crimes.
Okay, on that note, I have to take a quick break. I hate to keep cutting you off, Jed, but when we come back, we're going to have some comments about the state of education and what it means to the black community. Stay with us. Welcome back again, everyone. I'm Lynn Doyle, and we are checking in on Facebook. We're talking about African Americans and Martin Luther King, what he would say today about the state of the black community. Jim writes, everyone has a chance in America. Some choose to go down the wrong path, so don't blame the system. It's the criminal that we should be blaming. And Jeff writes, laws are largely written by rich white men who have little regard for the plight of poor people who use drugs to escape, sell drugs, and steal to have money to buy drugs. When I go to court in a white county and see 80% black defendants, I know inequity reigns on us still, 150 years after slavery ended. And then Jill writes, Lynn, I'm surprised you'd go there. Undereducated, countless baby daddies, poverty, lack of supervision, gangbangers, drugs. That can happen in any race, but I have to say the numbers are speaking for themselves.
Righty then, Jill, thank you for that.
The numbers don't speak for themselves. The numbers mask realities that we refuse to deal with. So, for example, let's just take the facts, okay? Montgomery County, it is the richest county in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. The average amount allocated per student, $21,000 per student. What's allocated in Philadelphia?
$250.
No, it's actually more than that. It's gone up now, but this is really relevant. I know we're talking about prison, but the reality is that when children drop out of school in 8th grade, because now as they sit in Philadelphia, there's 40 kids in a classroom with no assistance, no resources, then they get thrown into an environment in which they are victimized.
We are going to talk about education in a show in February, so I'm going to have this entire panel come back and talk about that because we didn't have enough time to talk about it today, but we're almost out of time. I need to know, is there optimism? Do we have hope that, that
certainly.
some of these issues can, if not be solved, at least compromised or resolved?
Some of Dr. King's last words from his mountaintop speech, I may not get there with you.
Yeah, but we will get to the promised land.
We're going to get there.
And beyond optimism, we're all prisoners of hope.
Right.
We hope for a better day. We hope for a better tomorrow. I would just simply say that it's not Dr. King vis-a-vis the African American community. It's Dr. King vis-a-vis humanity.
Right.
Dr. King came to humanity. He was born in that tradition so that we all could become tolerant. And we're going a step further with shows like what you have here, Lynn, with these esteemed colleagues.
And
that I'm happy to
allowing
be a
those
part
folks
of.
to put those comments on Facebook, feeling brave enough and loose enough to have them, but also being open to take in some sort of critiques, if you will, to have some dialogue. That's where we start, to keep Dr. King's dream alive with respect to humanity coming together.
It worries me about the dialogue because people always say that we should have dialogue, but the minute that someone says something that you don't agree with, then the dialogue seems like it disintegrates,
that's
that's frustrating.
But I think it becomes a challenge.
How else do you cure
You
it?
teach yourself how to speak with your words, keep your body still, and just have that.
It can't always be PC, we shall overcome, tiptoe through the tulips and kumbaya. Sometimes it has to be painful, and we don't have enough time, but there are a lot of things that we can do with character development, curriculums in school, and as important, King's nonviolent stance. We can promote that in our schools. We can promote that within ourselves.
And that's what we hope to do on this show today. I want to thank you all for being here. As promised, I knew it was going to be a great discussion. We could probably talk for another hour or more, probably the next 24 hours. But if you were unable to get through and you want to let our guests know what you're thinking, email me at lynn@lynndoyle.net, and I will be sure that I pass that along. Until the next time, my thanks to my crew and to you for watching. And as always, we always keep Dr. King in our hearts.